Why, hello there. In this video I'm giving my spoiler-free thoughts on The Last Faith. The Last Faith is developed by Kumi Souls and published by PlayStack, who provided me with a review code. My review is based on the 20 hours I spent with the game, completing the game with the true ending. The game describes itself as a dark, gothic fusion of Metroidvania and Soulslike. You play as Eric, an amnesiac who awakens in a ruined temple, cursed with an affliction that will send him on a journey that crosses paths with ancient religions and divinities. While not exactly breaking new ground for the genre, the art, atmosphere, combat, and world design make The Last Faith a solid Metroidvania and a very fun 2D Souls-like that surprised me with its variety of weapons and spells. And before we dive in, I want to humbly suggest giving the channel a follow, as I make videos about Metroidvanias, Souls, and Souls-like games quite a lot, and if you're here then I'd wager you're also interested in games of those genres. Let's get into it. First, I'd like to discuss the strengths of the game, and I want to start with the elephant in the room, Bloodborne. The art, atmosphere, and world is obviously heavily inspired by Bloodborne. Bloodborne is my favorite game, and I was skeptical that it would be able to favorably draw comparisons, but it totally worked for me in most cases. I'm pretty sure they literally used some of the same sound effects, and that was maybe a bit much. But otherwise, the Victorian setting and mix of gothic and cosmic horror is where The Last Faith draws from Bloodborne the most directly. And while these elements can be pulled pretty directly like special blood, it manages to have its own compelling world that drew me in. Learned primarily through item descriptions, of course, there is a well-realized world consisting of various factions and key players whose complicated history you unravel over the course of the game. One thing I really enjoyed about the composition of the lore of the game is that it's comprised of multiple short stories about different cities and major players, but ties them together in a way that provides a satisfying sense of cohesion. The story is not as strong as the world building for me, with your character's vaguely defined mission and mysterious backstory stringing everything together, but you come across plenty of bizarre characters to add some flavor to your journey. And even then, the story is in service to the atmosphere and world building, which are the real standout narrative elements, so it serves its purpose just fine in that sense. The next strength, which also ties into Bloodborne, is the combat. It borrows the basic loadout of Bloodborne, which consists of a main hand weapon accompanied by firearm or spells in your offhand. You can have 2 main weapons and 2 offhand weapons at a time without any sort of equip weight restrictions, and I had fun playing with my loadout tactically for the situation at hand throughout the game. Like Bloodborne, regardless of your build, you regularly engage in melee with your main weapon, and unlike Bloodborne, the firearms in this game serve primarily as a ranged option for dealing damage, using a limited stock of ammo that will be replenished by picking up more in the world or purchasing from a vendor. The spells work similarly to Hunter's Tools in Bloodborne by taking up a slot in your offhand, but instead of using ammo, they cost focus, the game's version of mana, which appears as a meter under your health bar and refreshes every time you stop at a checkpoint, or can be partially refilled using consumables. Your main weapons all have a special move that also uses focus to use. While special moves can't replace the trick weapons of Bloodborne, they were a highlight of the combat, with each weapon having a meaningfully different special attack that made it fun to experiment with different weapons. These special attacks range from being an enhanced version of their regular moveset, to changing the damage type of your weapon, to being a completely new attack with an AoE or increased range. And with 13 main weapons and a bunch of spells and firearms, there is a lot more weapon variety in this game when compared to other games of the genre. If you want to see the variety of weapons, I recommend Fightin' Cowboy's weapon showcase video, which shows off the variety of main weapons. The Last Faith has lighter RPG elements similar to Bloodborne that determine what weapons you'll be more proficient with. Note that you're not locked out of any weapons by stats though, you'll just have a penalty to your damage, which I thought was a neat way to allow for playing with all of the toys while still having your build matter. While I went heavy on strength in my playthrough, the game has tempted me to try out other builds to see the potential of focusing more on firearms and spells. On the more Metroidvania side of combat, There's no stamina meter to manage, with the focus being more on aggressive combat to deal damage quickly, while learning and dodging enemy attacks. There are equipable items called stigmas that let you equip one at a time to gain abilities like parrying to riposte attacks, a shield to block damage, and some other cool systems I won't spoil. The stats and variety of weapons and spells are the standout element of The Last Faith, especially in the 2D Metroidvania Souls-like genre, where the only other game I can think of that takes a similar approach is Death's Gambit. Before moving on, I wanted to mention that The Last Faith takes the consumable healing item approach akin to Bloodborne, not a rechargeable item like Estus Flask in Dark Souls, but it was never really an issue for me as you find plenty while you're out exploring the world, and it's relatively cheap to buy more from vendors. The enemies and bosses in this game are all pretty fun to fight, with some really fun and nasty visual designs that I really enjoyed. The Last Faith doesn't push the envelope on encounter design, but it's all very competent, with a mix of typical combat encounters and arena fights to mix things up. One issue I can have with arenas is that they become dead space when backtracking in the future, but I didn't find it to be a problem here, as they were often used on side paths as a barrier between important items. The boss fights are also very competent, if a bit on the easier side. They have interesting movesets to learn and provide good opportunities to mess around with your loadout and equip the right weapons for the job at hand. There is pretty decent variety in the scale and style of boss fights in The Last Faith, ranging from duels with other humans to fighting large monsters, and it all works pretty well. A huge positive for me personally is that, like Blasphemous 1, there are unique enemy execution moves for each enemy type that are gnarly and a whole bunch of fun to watch. I love it. Now let's talk about the game's strengths as a Metroidvania. It's got your classic double jump and air dash there, as well as wall climbing and a few other puzzle and platforming abilities. The main focus of the level design is the combat encounters, and the Metroidvania abilities are woven into the combat well, with mid and late game bosses and enemies demanding that you utilize abilities to evade enemy attacks and finding openings for you to attack. While the combat is king, the level design provides plenty of fun, if a bit breezy, platforming challenges that you'd expect from a Metroidvania. The level design also provides an organic sense of progression I enjoy in Metroidvanias, where moving through earlier areas becomes easier as your increased traversal verbs unlock new ways to navigate old spaces. This not only helps keep it fresh, but helps to keep the backtracking on the right side of fun versus tedious that all games in the genre walk. The game has a bonfire-esque checkpoint and fast travel system from the start, which is more akin to titles like Dark Souls 2 and 3 than Metroidvanias. However, this freedom of movement around the map doesn't hurt the world design or exploration. The checkpoints are often pretty fairly spaced out, so that you can get where you want to go without a ton of backtracking, while also being far enough apart to encourage you to revisit previous areas and explore previously unreachable parts of the map. And speaking of the map, the non-linear progression and interconnectivity of the world design is great. There are some fun and unexpected connections between areas, although as I'll discuss shortly, not quite as interconnected as it seemed like there might be at first. The game handles nonlinear progression really well. I always had multiple areas to explore, often surprising me in scale, and I could mark on my map anything I needed to return to later. And clearing marks from the map is objectively one of the best parts about Metroidvanias. When it comes to the weaknesses of the game, you'll notice these are more specific nitpicks than issues with any significant portion of the game. Overall, The Last Faith was very fun to play and really landed for me in many ways, but there were some issues I think are worth bringing up. Gruesome executions are a strength it shares with Blasphemous 1, and unfortunately it also shares what many consider to be one of the biggest weaknesses of Blasphemous 1, instant kill spikes and bottomless pits. While I'd say that the platforming of The Last Faith is stronger than Blasphemous 1, it still isn't quite tight enough to not make some of my deaths feel a bit cheap with the spikes and pits, and it just feels like an outdated approach in 2023. It brings the exploration, which is generally great, down just a bit for me. And while the spikes gave me some deaths that just didn't feel good, the pits were really the bigger issue, which had visual issues in both the level design and on the map. In many cases, there is fog to indicate that it's a kill box, but this was inconsistent. You can pan up and down a bit, but it was difficult to tell if this was just a blind drop or an instant death. This is compounded by issues with the map design. 100% exploring the map is one of the joys and sense of progression in a Metroidvania, and I found that my map would show areas of the map blacked out as unexplored unless I jumped into the pits to my death, which just felt bad. And the visual design of the pits and open sky on the map shows them as open without a line, which is the same visual language as the elevators on the map. This led me to mistakenly thinking for the majority of my playthrough that at some point I would be able to drop into these pits and survive, similar to Blasphemous 1. While it's not necessarily fair to hold something against the game that wasn't intended, the unclear map design made me think I'd get an ability similar to the Linen of Golden Thread, a relic that allowed you to drop through pits to whatever area was below it on the map. This was a really awesome way of recontextualizing the map and leveraging the vertical design to create some really cool and unexpected connections in the world, which again is not a totally fair comparison, but in a game that seemed to be following some of the same design philosophy as Blasphemous, in a genre that tends to build on other titles, I don't think it was an unreasonable assumption. Another weakness of the game was the variety in the visual design of locales. It wasn't egregious and there were some evocative scenes, but most areas in the game ended up being outside in a ruined gothic city, inside in an ornate mansion, cave, and snowy ruined gothic city or cave. It never really ran with any dreamscapes or more outlandish environments you might expect from a cosmic horror game. The color palette was also pretty muted, which added to the feeling of limited range and environments. This did add to the heaviness and dread of the atmosphere, but unfortunately this wasn't used in contrast at any point. Contrasting it with a brighter or more varied color palette could have been effective. A relatively minor issue I had was the enemy variety near the end of the game. There were usually a few unique enemies in each area that helped to mix things up, but in the final stretch the enemies were mostly if not all reused, which worked as something of a final exam, but it also made it feel a bit stale in terms of giving the area and the enemy encounters something fresh. Another small issue I found was with the starting classes. When I started the game I chose the Astrologer, a magic class in lieu of my usual strength build. However, upon starting the game I had no spells and a weapon that scaled with dexterity. This led to fighting the first boss with a weapon that had a penalty to damage because of my stats, low health because of the stat spread, with my primary stats being unused besides letting me use the special attack of my weapon a bit more, which I guess helped to offset the damage penalty, but didn't feel great. So I ended up restarting with the Brawler, a strength character, and never looked back. While this character confusingly also had the same dex weapon as the Astrologer, again giving my weapon a damage penalty for insufficient dexterity, the stat spread of the Brawler versus the Astrologer resulted in more health, and I was able to get by the boss much more easily. It's just a bit weird to even have different classes if there isn't really anything interesting and differences between them, like a different starting weapon or a special bit of equipment to get the builds started. And if the starting classes are just a difference in the stat spread, why start with a weapon that only favors one stat? As I mentioned earlier, I'm tempted to try some different builds, but I'd probably just start with the Dexterous Rogue in future playthroughs regardless of what I plan on ultimately doing with my build. On a related note, my final nitpick is that there's no respec in the game. As I stated earlier, you're not barred from using any weapon because of your stats, but your build still greatly influences your efficacy, and it's a bit of a bummer that you don't have the option to reallocate your stats if you want to try a different build partway through a run. The Last Faith is a solid Metroidvania 2D Souls-like with great atmosphere, an interesting world, and a variety of combat options that sets itself apart from most others in the Metroidvania genre. It does wear its Bloodborne inspirations on its sleeve with its settings and themes, but it doesn't simply copy From Software's homework, managing to create a surprisingly compelling world. I would give the game an 8.5, A score that is brought down some by specific issues I had with the game regarding insta-kill elements and how they're incorporated into the map and exploration, mild issues with the variety of environments and enemies in the endgame, and a lack of respec options to let you play with your build more. I'd say that if any of these issues feel like a deal breaker for you, check back in with the game in a little while, as I could see adjustments being made to the insta-kill elements and lack of respec down the road. If you found this review insightful, please give it a like, and consider subscribing to the Lore Hunter for more videos about Metroidvania, Souls, and Souls-like titles. Thanks for watching.